Hey guys, today we're going to take a deep dive into the world of yarn to determine the best type of yarn for your mosaic crochet projects. I was hoping to find a video like this when I first started doing mosaic crochet because I struggled with the type of yarn that I was finding at the craft stores. I knew there had to be something else better out there, like what are the experts using? Why do my designs not look as crisp and clean as everyone else's? And what is with all the holes? Because the mosaic crochet technique is so much different than regular crochet, the type of yarn actually really does make a difference. So we will be uncovering all of that today. This video is in no way sponsored by any yarn brands, so I'm going to be keeping my opinions very honest, but I'm also not dropping any names because this is really just about the characteristics to look for to get the best results. I am not a yarn expert, nor do I know very much about the yarn industry. What I do know is based on the research that I've done and the swatches and testing and what I like to use on a regular basis. So sit back, get some tea, and let's answer all these mosaic crochet questions. Let's start out by talking about what makes a good mosaic crochet yarn. What kind of characteristics are we looking for when we're doing mosaic crochet? So of course when we're doing overlay, we have yarn that crosses over in rows, which means we don't want to have a yarn that's super thin here. We want to be able to cover what's behind it. So a yarn that is not too tight, it has a little bit of fluffiness to it, so it will fill up a stitch space and not let any of the rows behind it show through. We're always going to have these little holes, but with a better, fluffier yarn, these are camouflaged a whole lot better. So you can see, even though this is actually a cotton yarn, the fibers are fluffy enough that it is not going to show through the rows behind it. Another thing we want to look for is the fuzziness of a yarn, or a halo of the yarn. This is when the fibers are loose on the outside of the yarn, and if you have a lot of this fuzziness, it's going to actually distract from the contrast of your pattern. So really, the cleaner the yarn, the cleaner the design will be. You really want to stick to a plied yarn, so multi-strands, not a single strand. And even though I have done a few that were single strand, I find that the stitches actually twist on themselves and they don't produce a clean overlay. And last but not least, probably the most important thing is you want to decide what kind of project you're making. So for example, a cotton yarn would be really good for items that are flat, like for table runners, placemats, mug rugs. And then you would want something softer for pillows like a merino wool or maybe an acrylic blend or one of the more interesting novelty yarns. Really, it all depends on what kind of project you're making, which will help you make a better decision on which yarn to start with. So let's break this down into 4 separate groups. We have cotton, wool and other natural animal fibers, plastic, and wood. Yeah, seriously, we have wood. I have a lot to say about this one, but we'll get to that. This is obviously not a complete list of all of the yarn that you can use when crocheting, but for mosaic crochet, if I know it absolutely does not work, I'm not going to include it in this video. And because I'm actually not crocheting in this video, I have swatches, like 28 swatches of all the different yarn that I've tested just for this video. I have some real fun ones in here. Let's start with good old cotton here, and I have a few swatches to go along with that. In case you're wondering, I used part of the Gothic Skulls pattern to do all of these swatches. All of these are using worsted weight yarn and an H hook. Unless I couldn't get that yarn in worsted weight, then I will either go up or down. I wanted to try and get as much as possible for this video, so I did my best. Like this one I couldn't find in white, but I needed to get an example of this kind of yarn here. So cotton yarn is strong, absorbent, and breathable. The longer the fibers, the higher the grade. So when you have a yarn that is like a cheaper yarn that has shorter fibers, they have to spin the yarn tighter, so it makes the yarn more of like a hard cord instead of a soft yarn. So when you're looking for a cotton yarn to use for mosaic crochet, you want to find a fluffier yarn that is less tightly woven. Like this one is a good medium. Also, what's interesting about cotton is it really has absolutely no stretch to it whatsoever. So however thick it is here is as thick as it's going to be in your project. And the samples I have here, I wanted to show you, this is what I mean by a lesser grade cotton. These strands are super tightly woven, so you end up having a lot of holes. You can see with the special stitches in here, it ends up pulling giant holes, and you can see the rows behind it. So we really don't want to have a yarn like this. This cotton is really not a good idea, and I will tell you that this is from a craft store and I do not recommend it. If you go for a little bit of a higher grade and you go for one that is a lot more fluffy, you will see that the holes are a lot less on this one. You can't really see much through it. What's beautiful about cotton is there's practically no fuzzies. So you can have black and white yarn next to each other and you're not going to have any distortion of your designs. Nice, crisp, clean. This kind of yarn gets me excited because then everything that I do comes out crisp and clean and wonderful, but you just got to make sure that the yarn is still fluffy enough. And here's another one that is similar grade, nice and fluffy yarn, not too many holes, and it is super soft. And I'll tell you right now, I use this one for all of my special stitches and photos, so this is what I usually go for. I also love this yarn for making bags because it's a lot more, there's a lot more substance to a cotton yarn. I feel like it holds up better, it's strong and durable. I love cotton yarn. I just wish I found out about it sooner because I started with acrylic and that was a nightmare. And then we have another kind of cotton that's, I hope I'm pronouncing this right, mercerized cotton, which is a process that they put the yarn through in order to make it stronger and for it to take dye better. But what's not good is holy cow, how many holes are in this? So many holes. This is what you want to avoid. It makes the yarn so tight that no matter what size hook that you use, no matter how tight or loose, it will fight with you because there is absolutely no give to this yarn. It is just a tight, no good. So mercerized, even though it's so pretty, no, it doesn't work because this is just not what we want at all. We don't want to see holes. And now let's move on to wool. I'm calling it the wool category, even though there are definitely more than just one animal in this category. This one's going to cover all of the natural animal fibers. So before I really dove headfirst into the world of yarn, I really didn't know much about wool yarn. I'm from New York and we went to craft stores for our yarn and wool wasn't really available, and all I knew about it was expensive and it was scratchy, and I really didn't know anything at all about the wonders of merino and cashmere and all of those other luxurious yarns. So I have a few of those here. Wool is like the wonder fiber of the world, and I wish I knew about it a long time ago. So wool is fire resistant. It could soak up water without actually feeling wet. It's antimicrobial, it's hypoallergenic, it's very flexible, it has so much bounce to it, and it's stain resistant. It's like, why are we not just using wool for everything? Is it good for mosaic crochet? Well, I absolutely fell in love with merino and I pretty much use it whenever I can. Unfortunately, it is super expensive and definitely not cost effective if you're doing things like blankets or large items. But if you're doing things like pillows and small little gifts for people, merino wool is amazing. And let's take a look at one of my absolute favorites. You might be able to tell what brand this is, but I'm not telling. The fibers are very bouncy, so they tend to fill up the stitch space very nicely. It also, even though it does have a little bit of fuzz on it sometimes, you have a little bit of white fibers. It's all part of the natural material, and the softness makes up for it, in my opinion. With a very stretchy yarn like this, you do sometimes get some holes. Like if you overstuff a pillow, you might have that problem, but for the most part, I absolutely recommend trying this kind of yarn. This is also a regular wool yarn. This one's a little bit scratchier. I know some people have sensitivity to wool yarn, which is why I go with the softer ones. But same as before, it's nice and fluffy. It covers up the rows pretty well. It is very, very stretchy. And then we have alpaca. And even though it's nice and soft, this one I find has way too many of those fibers, and it does tend to distort the design a bit, in my opinion. I like my mosaics super clean, so these fibers I'm not a super fan of. And then just for this video, I went out and I bought cashmere yarn because why not? This was probably the most money I've ever spent on a yarn, and I got like this much of it, so I don't know what I'm going to do with the rest of it, but I had to know, is it worth it? I mean, it does feel really nice. I don't know if it feels that much nicer than like a merino, but we have a little bit of fibers, not too bad. This ends up being a very puffy yarn, and sometimes that's not good because it ends up kind of distorting the image a bit because it fills up so much. So I don't know, it's up to you. If you like cashmere, I'd say go for it, but I don't know if I'll spend that much money on yarn again. Okay, let's get into this plastic yarn. This is the headache that started it all for me, and the reason why I needed to find something better. I get so blinded by these awesome colors, but really I have a love-hate relationship with plastic yarn. Of course, I also mean acrylic, polyester, nylon, polyamide, and all those other weird fibers that are all synthetic and man-made out of petroleum. So when we're talking about acrylic versus like polyester, they both have different characteristics, but they are pretty much made out of the same materials. Polyester tends to be a little more breathable and durable, and acrylic doesn't breathe at all. It pills, and acrylic is hot. So although polyester and acrylic are basically made in a very similar process, polyester tends to act more like a cotton and acrylic acts more like a wool, but really they are all plastics, and plastics is bad, the end. But I do have a love-hate relationship with acrylic because you do get all of these crazy, fun, novelty yarns, which you can absolutely work into Mosaic Crochet. So we have velvet and glitter yarn, metallic yarn. There's so many fun things with plastic yarn, but when you're just going to use it for making standard Mosaic Crochet, this is where my nightmare began. Because with the cheaper yarns, unfortunately, I feel like as you're crocheting, they're getting fuzzy, they're pilling, you have a ton of loose fibers because it's not strong and durable. We don't really have much of a problem with it filling up a stitch space. They fill out a lot. Sometimes they fill out too much, so it makes it kind of bulky looking. And if you're doing like black and white, like I do a lot of black and white, these fibers end up making it just look dirty, and that is just not fun. Ugh, okay. And yeah, we can get blinded by all the gorgeous colors, but even this one, slightly better grade, but it just falls apart. And forget about it when you're using this yarn to make pillows and blankets, and you know, one wash and you're gonna really regret you spent all those months working on a project because it's gonna look like garbage. But then, surprisingly, I have found some acrylic yarn that's like magical, and I don't know what this company did, but there's like no fuzzies whatsoever on this one. So there are acrylic yarns out there that really are top of the line, premium, amazing, but I find that the yarn brands that say they're premium are usually like the worst. I'm sorry, but it's true. These guys just said, hey, I am acrylic yarn, and oh, it's gorgeous and it feels soft, but we're gonna see how long this stays like this, because I have very little faith in acrylic. I'm sorry, I do, but that's the truth. And then I have a sample here that is polyester, and I don't know. I don't know if it's just this brand, it just doesn't, the fibers are very loose, it's not very clean, it feels a little bulky, I don't know. Not super happy with it. There might be other brands out there that do polyester a little bit better, but just based on this one, I am not a big fan of it. I don't have any 100% nylon, but there are a lot of yarn blends that use nylon, which is very strong and durable, also made out of the same plastic. But I do have some blends that I can show you that have nylon in it. But for now, that is all I have to say about acrylic. Okay, let's talk about wood yarn. You probably know it better as rayon, cellulose, acetate, viscose, modal, lyocell, tencel, and also bamboo, birch, beech, and eucalyptus. And all of that is basically the exact same yarn. And rayon was originally produced just to make artificial silk, and that is what this is. The process for turning wood fibers into things like yarn and fiber uses a lot of chemicals. It's actually really toxic for workers, but the way they used to make rayon, thankfully they don't really make it like that too much anymore. They have done a lot of advances and they have changed the names along the way. Viscose tends to be a little less toxic to the environment, but it is still not good. I feel like it's a little sneaky to use keywords like bamboo because most people think bamboo is renewable and good for the environment, but that is actually not the case. So far with the research that I've done, there's really only one type of rayon that uses a much better process to make this kind of yarn, and that's lyocell. There's far fewer byproducts. It uses a closed system, so there's a lot less waste to the environment. It is safer for workers, but if a yarn company is not going to say that that's what it is on the label, I wouldn't trust them. So don't get blinded by words like bamboo because they're not always good for the world. So let's start with what this is. This is viscose yarn. Unfortunately, I couldn't get it in worsted weight. I can only find it in a DK weight, so it is a little bit smaller, but it does have a really nice shine to it. It does have a lot of bounce. It does do a pretty decent job with not having too many holes. Yeah, it's nice. There's no fibers either. No fibers sticking out. It's super clean. This one is lyocell, which is supposed to be the one that has the better manufacturing process, which does make me feel a little bit better about using this one. It is nice to use in bags. I do see some like loose fibers though. I don't know how well it's going to hold up when I wash it or if it's used a lot. We're going to have to wait and see with those. And we have this one, which is a bamboo silk blend. But again, I don't know where this bamboo came from. I don't know what process it was used to make it. So I don't know how I feel about it. It is super silky. The colors are pretty vibrant. There are a little bit of loose fibers, but really this is a very pretty yarn. I want to see how it holds up. And then for fun, I did a recycled silk yarn for this sample, and oh my god, this is not a good one. First of all, it's single strand. It is very inconsistent in thickness, so it makes all of these bumps, and I would really not recommend it. But this is 100% silk and it is recycled. It was a fun little thing I wanted to try out, but I really don't like how it looks, so I don't know. And we have one last category to talk about, which is all of the blends of the other 4 yarn types. So starting with this one, this is 50-50 cotton wool, which I am very intrigued about. I like the fact that this one has no loose fibers. It is super clean looking, and it does have a little bit more puffiness than a standard cotton yarn would. And so unfortunately this is the only sample that I have, but I did buy a whole lot more because I'm really curious about this one. I'm really thinking this would be a really good yarn for Mosaic Crochet. I also have 2 here. One is 80% acrylic and 20% wool, which is basically the type of wool that you'll find in regular craft stores. And then this one here is 50% acrylic and 50% wool. So I really want to see these guys side by side. how they hold up, if it makes any difference, if there's more wool or less wool in them. I also have a cotton and acrylic blend here, which does look really nice. Again, I'm not sure if adding acrylic to a cotton will make it any more durable, or if it's just going to add to the fuzziness, which I'm already seeing on this. And then we have ones that are cotton and modal, which if you follow me, you know I use this one all the time. It makes the cotton a lot more fluffy, and it has that really nice shine to it, which I do like for pillows and bags. And it doesn't even really look like cotton because of how fluffy it is. But again, fibers. So I don't know if the blends are good or not. We will find out. Oh, and you want to talk about fuzzies? Let's talk about fuzzies. This is like almost a joke. I really wanted to see how this would come out, but this is alpaca and nylon, and you could see it almost makes the design look blurry. There are just an insane amount of fuzzies in this yarn, and it is too puffy, and I don't know. It could have some really cool effects, but that is what this one ends up looking like. Oh, and then we have this guy right here, this poor little sample here. This is the first sample I did last year when I wanted to see how this yarn would work, and it doesn't work. This is a single strand wool nylon blend, and again we have yarns that are inconsistent, and for some reason it is just way too bouncy and unmanageable and in like a rigid way. The stitches are super twisted. It doesn't lay nicely. I can't stand this one. And now before we end this video, I'm gonna do something I've been wanting to do for a very, very long time. And that is actually put all these guys to the test. I am gonna rough up this side here, and we are gonna add some tea to this party. And then we're gonna throw these in the wash and really, really see which ones stain, which ones will hold up to the washer and dryer, which ones lose more fibers. So I'm gonna mess up all of these guys, and I will come back tomorrow after these are all washed and dry and show you the results. Hey guys, it's the next day, and of course my neighbors decided to do some yard work today, so I apologize if there's some noisiness in the background. It's December. I don't know why they're doing yard work, but it is what it is. So I had a little bit of a mishap yesterday. I put all of these in one bag, and I was planning on putting them in with my son's laundry, and during the wash they ended up opening up and went everywhere. So these guys went through a whole lot yesterday. They were everywhere. Let's get a closer look at the cotton samples that we have. So this first one was the one I was not very happy with in the beginning because the yarn was very tight, and it looks like this one did puff up a bit, so it actually doesn't look as bad as when we originally crocheted it. We do have some staining, which I am not surprised. It soaked up the liquid like a sponge, but overall it held up pretty decent. Not too bad. The two higher grade cottons that we had done samples of look really good, actually. They have a little bit of staining, but really not too bad. They definitely held up very, very well in the wash. There's not much loose fibers. I would have no problem using this type of yarn again for many different projects. Onto the wool. These guys don't look well. The merino wool that we have here, it stained very bad. It got very fuzzy. Even though this one is listed as a superwash wool, it didn't really do very well in the washing machine. It looks super dingy and dirty, and I don't know. The other merino wool that we sampled actually held up quite well in the wash, so I'm very happy about that. There's less fibers than the other one, and it doesn't look like it's stained at all, so that's good. The ends are still a kind of a hot mess, but this is, again, it's a superwash, so we would expect it to hold up. This one also was a superwash wool. I don't know what happened, but it really did not do well in the washer or dryer. It got very fuzzy. The fibers kind of fell apart. And of course, like, if a yarn says don't put it in the washer and dryer, maybe don't put it in the washer and dryer, but I was just curious what would happen, and it did not come out well. So the alpaca, same thing. It kind of shrunk a little bit. The fibers are all over the place. Definitely hand wash things like alpaca. And the cashmere did pretty good. This one also was one of those please hand wash kind of situations, but I said no, I want to see what it looks like, and it didn't do too bad. And onto our acrylic. This is no surprise to me. This is the cheapo acrylic that made me super angry, and it is just a fibery mess. This is also supposed to be washable. You can throw these in the dryer, but this just, it did not come out well. And here we have the acrylic that I was very excited about. This is the one that didn't have many fibers at all, and it held up really, really well in the wash. And you can kind of see what happened here and get a better idea of what this yarn is made up of. It looks like this one is very, very tiny strands that are spun together, and that definitely helps to keep the yarn a little more stable, even though it is an acrylic. And here we have the polyester. Not much of a change at all. I think it did really well in the wash. I'm just not a fan of how the yarn looks in general, but hey, it did wash really well and not much change from where we started. And here's another acrylic, another one that makes me angry because it's such a pretty color, but it falls apart. And we have fibers, you can probably see, just everywhere, sticking out. You can pull them apart. It's not a good quality, and even the ends have just frayed, and it's not good. The novelty yarns did pretty good. The metallic one does have a little bit of fuzziness around it, but it's really not that noticeable. But that's just kind of the nature of metallic yarn, with that little bit of fuzz on the top. The glitter yarn that is mostly acrylic with these polyester tinsel pieces did not hold up well. We have a ton of excess fibers sticking out. Big surprise. This is also the same brand as this guy, but I wanted to see if this would do any better, and it doesn't. Lastly, we have the velvet yarn, which looks exactly the same as when I put it into the wash, so yay for velvet. And now we have our wood category, and we do have some staining on these. This one was the viscose yarn. It does look pretty good. We have acetate yarn here that did pretty decent. This one lost a lot of fibers in the beginning, but then with the wash, it kind of took away some of those fibers, and it does look pretty decent. The lyocell yarn did awesome. I'm so excited about that. It really, really held up well. I don't see any loose fibers at all. The only thing is it got a little crushed in when I took it out of the dryer, which did mess up a little bit of the flatness of the stitches. So I would definitely recommend hand washing these guys anyway. The bamboo and silk probably looks the worst out of this whole set. I don't know if it's because it's a blend, but lots of extra fibers that I didn't even see when we first crocheted this, so this did not hold up well. And lastly, this is the silk that looks just as gross as it did when we put it in, before we put it in the wash. And let's take a look at the blends. The cotton and wool definitely held up very nice, but lots of staining. Just maybe don't pour tea on your work and you'll be okay. The cotton and acrylic blend held up fairly well. I do see, probably because of the acrylic in here, we have a lot of loose fibers, and it definitely does not look as clean as the 100% cotton yarns did. The cotton modal blend, also same thing, a lot of loose fibers. A lot of fibers came off when I was rubbing this with liquid, And I thought that would help to kind of clean this up, but it almost just made it worse. So unfortunately, I would try and be a little more gentle with this type of blend of cotton and either acrylic or these modal blends. They don't really hold up too well when you wash them. Okay, these two I really wanted to see side by side. These are the wool acrylic blends. This top one here is the 80-20 and this one is the 50-50. And really, I don't see too much of a difference. If anything, I think the 50-50 has more fibers because of more of the wool content in here. If we didn't abuse these and put them in the washer and dryer, this one might probably hold up better just because it has less acrylic in it. As for using these in the future, I really like using the 50-50 a little bit more. I feel like this tends to act way more like acrylic because there's just too much of it in there. And both of these I think are really good alternative when you don't want to spend a ton of money on wool, but you still want to have a higher quality yarn. Oh, and you knew this, these were not going to go well in the washer and dryer, and they absolutely didn't. This just melted into oblivion. This one was the alpaca and nylon, which was absolutely destroyed in the washer and dryer. I think the heat just melted it, and it is just not even, it was gross before, but this is just so much worse. And of course, this one probably shouldn't have gone in the washer and dryer either. It just is destroyed. It is super fibrous and matted and gross. So here are my picks for my favorite yarns to use for Mosaic Crochet. When you're going for a cotton, always look for a yarn that has a little more substance to it and is not tight, so it will not show the rows behind it. I would go with a higher quality merino wool if you're going to use wool, and be careful when you are washing this. Even if it does say superwashed, just be careful. If you're going to use a rayon type yarn, I would absolutely recommend lyocell over all of the other ones. When you want to save a little bit of money on wool yarn, you can get some that have a little bit of acrylic in it. You will still see some loose fibers, but it is definitely an upgrade to just 100% acrylic. If you are going to go ahead with a 100% acrylic, I would definitely do some swatches and make sure that it doesn't have a lot of fibers. This one is fantastic. I'm personally going to try and use a little more cotton wool 50-50 blend. I like the fact that it's super clean and is still very flexible and bouncy because of the wool in there, so we'll see how this one goes for me. And one of my favorite novelty yarns, I definitely recommend playing around with velvet yarn for Mosaic Crochet. You don't have a lot of the clean lines, but it is just so fun and it feels really nice also. So I hope you enjoyed this video. I will be coming out with new videos pretty soon, doing actual patterns and crocheting, so hope to see you next time. Thanks!